Have you checked the children?
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the horror show. I'm Cecil Laird, and I am here to do something that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, but for whatever reason, I just didn't get around to it. Quite frankly, it was because doing the show on the daily basis like we were didn't leave me a lot of time to do bigger form videos that are better produced like this one is intended to be. So I finally had some time to focus on it in the lead up to the relaunch. So now it's my turn to talk about my favorite horror movie from every single year that I've been alive. And that, of course, is going to start with the year I was born, that is 1980. So the year 1980 was definitely a good year for horror, and for most of these years I'm going to give you a runner-up and then my favorite of the year. Again, this is not intended to be the best horror movie of each year. This is my favorite horror movie from each year. And you may not necessarily agree that a movie I am saying is my favorite horror movie of the year is horror. That is fine. You can feel free to disagree in the comments down below, but these are all horror enough in my eyes to be put on this list. And having been a lifelong horror fan, it only made sense to actually do this. So for 1980, the year I was born, there were movies like Maniac. The original Maniac came out. Of course, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. That is not one that's ever been at the tops of my list. So the two I am going to talk about are, of course, the original Friday the 13th. That is my runner-up. It is the movie that launched 1,000 Jasons, so I have to have it up there. It's not necessarily one that I revisit a whole bunch when I think about watching a Friday the 13th movie. However, I do absolutely respect that it's the origin, and it was a great horror movie, especially a slasher, because it subverted expectations, making Mrs. Voorhees the killer instead of the, typical male slasher like there were at the time. So that is my runner-up, but my favorite horror movie from 1980 is one that's actually grown on me over time. The first time I watched it, I remember not liking it very much for whatever reason. I don't really remember exactly why, but we recently revisited it within the past year or so on the channel, and I really fell in love with it for the first time having watched it again. And that is John Carpenter's The Fog. I think this is such an excellent horror movie, and Carpenter obviously is of the highest horror pedigree for various reasons. I mean, and we're going to talk about some on this list, so I'm not going to rattle them off, but I really like this movie. It's got great performances. There's some hamminess, of course, between Jamie Lee Curtis and oh God, I'm gonna forget his name now, but the dude from Halloween 3. There's some awkwardness with that rushed quote-unquote relationship, I guess, but the story of a town that is cursed to have these ghost zombie pirate lepers, or they're not pirates, but ghost lepers, a leper colony showing up and taking people out as they were pirates too. I don't know. I can't remember the specifics. It's been over a year since I've seen it, and I've watched, like 300 to 400 horror movies a year, so it gets lost in the sauce a little bit. But you can watch our review on the channel. I really enjoyed it this time around, so definitely The Fog is my favorite horror movie from 1980. '81 definitely had a few horror gems as well. You had the original Sam Raimi, The Evil Dead. You had An American Werewolf in London, both utter classics. But then you also had a movie that I didn't actually see until doing this channel just a couple of years ago. Finally, I got around to watching it, and I loved it, and I know that if I had watched it when I was growing up, it would have been in my regular rotation. So my runner-up for 1981 is going to be the original My Bloody Valentine. I really enjoy that movie and its utter gore craziness, so I definitely want to shout that out as the runner-up. But my favorite movie of 1981 is the other werewolf movie that came out that year, The Howling. I like The Howling more than American Werewolf in London. We can have that discussion another day. But The Howling has, in my opinion, the best werewolf transformation of all time. And it's just a more enjoyable story to me. And it's not slapsticky like the other one tries to be. So I just enjoy The Howling as a fantastic werewolf horror movie, and easily the best horror movie of 1981 for me. So 1982 might not have been the biggest year for horror, but it definitely had a couple of gems, and specifically, it does happen to have my favorite horror movie of all time. First off, obviously, there was Creepshow. There was also, for some people, Halloween 3. That is nowhere near the tops for me, but outside of those two, my runner-up for 1982 is going to be the original Poltergeist. So this is the one that was made by Steven Spielberg and I believe Tobe Hooper, if I'm not mistaken, but there's always been a question in the air as to whether or not it was actually Tobe that directed it or Spielberg that stepped in and directed this one. Nonetheless, Poltergeist happens to be one of my favorite horror movies, but not my favorite. My favorite horror movie of all time happens to be the other release from 1982, which is John Carpenter's The Thing, a remake of The Thing from Another World, or in more appropriately, a new adaptation of the original Who Goes There material. And it's just phenomenal. What can be said about John Carpenter's The Thing that hasn't been said before that definitely justifies the amount of attention that this movie gets? With some of the greatest effects of all time in horror, this movie deserves any and all attention it gets throughout the years. It is fantastic. It's got fantastic performances. It's a genuinely scary movie. It's got effects to die for that are just unbelievable, even to this day in 2021. I mean, The Thing is, to me, a perfect horror movie, and I don't know that anyone could ever say anything to convince me otherwise. So yes, The Thing is my favorite horror movie of 1982. So 1983 had some good choices as well. A couple of good Stephen King choices, both Cujo and, of course, Christine came out this year as well. By the way, sometimes my shirt is going to be a hint as to what my choice is going to be. Sometimes it is not. Just tried to find theme shirts for each year if I possibly could get close to it. But besides that, there was also Videodrome. And then you get to my runner-up, which is Sleepaway Camp, the original Sleepaway Camp. It's not that the movie is fantastic or anything like that, but it does have one of the most stick-with-you endings of any horror movie that I've seen, especially since I saw it when I was younger. That ending really threw me for a loop and was probably my first exposure to a PC culture that was coming straight down the line of accepting lots of different things, but at the time it was pretty shocking. So I definitely like Sleepaway Camp. Plus, it was my first exposure to a really cool person in Felissa Rose, the actress from the movie, or actor, I should say, from the movie. We've met her numerous times throughout the conventions, so it's a fun movie to revisit even to this day. So Sleepaway Camp, definitely a runner-up for me. But my favorite, and a lot of you guys are probably going to poop on me for this one, but again, these are my favorite horror movies from each year, not necessarily what I think are the best ones. So my favorite from 1983, Jaws 3D. That's right. It is not a good movie, but there are so many cheesy parts to it that are fun, and it holds a special place in my heart because, not only because it's Jaws, obviously, Jaws is right up there with The Thing as one of my top horror movies of all time. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. It started me down the road of being scared of all kinds of water creatures, especially sharks, because they exist in real life, and they always stick with me the entire series. But 3, I really like lots of parts of 3. I mean, yes, the shark at the end just kind of glides through the glass instead of thrusting itself through the glass like it would need to, so the effects are really cheesy towards the end, but they were trying to achieve a 3D effect with the glass. Outside of that, there was still a lot of really cool effects. For instance, when the hunter guy gets trapped in the cage with the great white, and the great white ends up eating him, and you hear the crunching, and it cuts to the backward angle where you see the blood spurt out and everything. And yes, that guy's dead body does end up being the Deus Ex Machina at the end, that they grab the pin out of the grenade to blow up the shark at the end. Louis Gossett Jr., one of my first exposures to him before I watched, his older movies around that time. But I was into him because of Diggstown, believe it or not, around that time as I was growing up, I discovered. So anyway, it's a whole different discussion. But yeah, Jaws 3, lots of silliness, but for some reason, I really still dig it. The idea of a shark loose at SeaWorld is the biggest thing. It was the first time like a real life place got involved in a movie, so it like somehow brought Jaws even further into reality. Because I was like, oh my God, I can go visit that SeaWorld, and maybe they don't have the underwater tunnel system, but it can still go to a SeaWorld and see that kind of stuff. And the fact that there might be a great white around, I mean, it blew my mind. So yeah, Jaws 3D, believe it or not, my favorite horror movie from 1983. So 1984 obviously had some gems, but there's only really one runner-up, and then obviously my favorite. The next closest to runner-up was Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. I do enjoy that installment, still not my favorite Friday the 13th, but that would lead to the runner-up, which is Gremlins, starring this little guy right here. Does he still turn on? I wonder if he's still... Oh, look at that. Yep, you're gonna get me demonetized. Copywritten music. But yeah, Gremlins, obviously, you guys, it's kind of a kid's horror movie. It is absolutely still a horror movie, and yes, I do consider it a Christmas horror movie as well. Some of the best creature effects, especially the stripe melting at the end. I thought that is just so good. And Gizmo, obviously the introduction to Gizmo, the introduction to the old man and his shop of curiosities, to Billy and his totally damaged girlfriend. I absolutely love Gremlins, so that is my runner-up. But my number one, if it wasn't obvious, and obvious by these guys over here, especially this one, part of the original series, Nightmare on Elm Street. The very first installment of the series is 1984. It launched all the Freddy, everything, quite frankly. All the movies, all the comics, the TV show, the memorabilia, everything, all of it comes from this original Nightmare on Elm Street installment. Even Dylan's New Nightmare, which I'm going to be making, is part of this canon, or at least in my own mind it is. So I think that this is something that is special. It's a slasher that is scary for so many different reasons, even outside of just there's a guy after me trying to kill me. It's in your dreams. You don't have control over this guy, and he can manipulate what you see in your dreams to really make them nightmares until he ultimately kills you. I mean, it's the coolest slasher, the coolest original idea for a movie like this, a horror movie, and the coolest design for a slasher. Freddy is the best, and it all started with A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. So 1985 was a bit of a slimmer year for me as far as what I thought was horror worth talking about. You had the original Fright Night, which I did really like, and that might actually bounce between the runner-up and this one as the runner-up, to be honest with you. But I remember really liking my runner-up, which was Demons. That is, I believe, an Italian movie that made it over here and was released in 85, and it was about a group of people that went to a specific horror movie screening, and there's a item from the movie in the lobby, I think, and it scratches someone, and that person ends up turning into a demon. Then it spreads the more that she slashes through victims. It's gore galore. It's really cool demon design. It's what I think of when I think of demons first. There's another movie I'll talk about later, and then this movie when it comes to how I picture demons. And so, yeah, Demons from 1985, definitely my runner-up, but my favorite horror movie from 1985. Definitely would not have always been the case. It took me a while to warm up to this movie, and until recently, actually, within the last few years, when I rewatched it with a more broad appreciation for horror in general, that is, of course, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. I really like this movie. I think it personally has the scariest Freddy that we had of all of the movies. It had a lot of really cool scenes. The school bus scene at the very beginning is one of, if not the scariest scene in all of Freddy movies. So I really, really enjoyed the most recent time I watched it. Yes, it's got those overtones, undertones, whatever you want to call them. Nonetheless, it's a very enjoyable movie, and it's trying to, well, the writer will say differently, but one would assume it's trying to say something about that. It was trying to be an allegory of, something trying to come out, but other people around you not wanting it to. So there's a lot of depth to the movie. The acting is so much fun, and obviously Mark Patton recently put out his Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street movie about his experience on this film. So a lot of great stuff to watch in regards to this one, and then this just also happens to be a fantastic entry in the Nightmare franchise. So Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, my favorite horror movie from 1985. So the next year that we're talking about is obviously 1986, and this is arguably one of, if not the biggest year for horror movies that's ever happened. There is, some contention between this and 1987, and some would even say 1993 or 4, but that is a discussion for a separate day and a separate video that likely is coming, a new great horror debate where we are going to argue what is the best year for horror. So stay tuned for that coming up in the not too distant future, but there were a lot of great horror movies that came out this year, including the shirt's sake here, Little Shop of Horrors came out, the one featuring, of course, Rick Moranis and Steve Martin with Audrey 2, the plant from space coming down. Love that movie, but still not the runner-up or the best. There was also Invaders from Mars, the original The Hitcher. There was also Friday the 13th Part 6. And then also The Fly, which is a big, excellent horror movie and a screaming contender. But ultimately, they were all edged out by the runner-up, which is Critters. I love Critters as a franchise. I love Critters as creatures, and I loved the original Critters as a movie. Critters and Critters 2 are excellent horror movies that are super fun creature features that are both funny and cool and scary at times in ways, not super scary, but they did a better job of that in the first one and the second one. But nonetheless, I really enjoy Critters, and of course, the absolute best horror movie, and some of you might say that's sci-fi action. Bull. It's a sequel to a horror movie. Some people might say that's just sci-fi. But I'm talking about Aliens, you guys. Aliens is one of, if not my favorite horror movie of all time. No, The Thing is my favorite, but Aliens is up there in the top 5 for sure. I love this movie. It's obviously the continuation of Ripley's story from the original Alien, which I don't like the original Alien nearly as much as I like the second one. Aliens was one of the James Cameron Holy Trinity for me. So it was The Abyss, it was Aliens, and it was Terminator 2. All of which had extended editions that I seeked out later when they became available, and I think all of them are enhanced by the extra footage and extra storytelling in each of those movies. And yeah, Aliens is fantastic. There's just no arguing that there's not a better horror movie that year. Some of you guys may argue, and again, put it in the comments below, but personally, Aliens is by far the winner here. 1987 is one of those years that absolutely blew me away as far as the amount of amazing horror that actually came out that year. So starting all the way from Creepshow 2 to The Gate to Jaws 4 to The Lost Boys to Monster Squad, even to Near Dark, you had the original Predator, you had Prince of Darkness, and you even had Evil Dead 2, which is a fantastic movie, and yet I found two movies that I had more affinity for in this particular year of their release, 1987. The runner-up being the one that my shirt is alluding to, which is none other than the original Hellraiser. I mean, this movie introduced the Cenobites to me. It introduced the Lament configuration to me. I was really excited to watch this movie. It was a really scary movie. It was a gory movie. It introduced the scariest demons in cinema history, in my opinion, in the Cenobites. So I really, really enjoyed Hellraiser. So what movie could possibly outshine Hellraiser for me than none other than The Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3? That's right, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 Dream Warriors. It is widely known as a lot of people's favorite Freddy movie. It is my favorite Freddy movie, but it is up there with Wes Craven's New Nightmare. You guys know how much I love that one, which I may or may not be touching on in the future of this video, but Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 is the culmination of the Freddy series. You still had a scary Freddy, you had the beginning of a little bit of silliness, you had some really super creative kills, you had good effects. Ultimately, it was just a really great entry into the series. The most enjoyable. Patricia Arquette did a great job. We got the Freddy Snake. You had Nancy, Heather Langenkamp returning to her role from the original movie. Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors. I mean, how much explaining do I have to do? That's obviously the best horror movie of 1987. '88 continues this trio of years of huge amounts of excellent horror movies. You had The Blob, which is fantastic, and Fuego would tell you is probably the best of that year. You also had Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4. You had Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, kind of not horror, but still horror adjacent enough. It's silly horror. I enjoyed for that. You also had Hellraiser 2, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, so that was a solid one. And then, of course, you had Pumpkinhead. All of these movies are super solid in this year, but the runner-up for the year, again, a couple of hints. I'm wearing the shirt as the hint. It's not these guys, it's these guys right here. Killer Clowns from Outer Space, 1988, the Chiodo brothers. I am so excited to hear that they might be working on something new, maybe a Netflix thing, finally continuing the Killer Clowns from Outer Space lore. I just absolutely adore that movie. As silly and stupid as it is, it's still really frightening to me. So I think that Killer Clowns from Outer Space and It from 1990, those two movies are the two movies that made people scared of clowns, as scared of clowns as they are. Personally, it was Killer Clowns for me, and I know a lot of people say it was Tim Curry in It 1990, but that is 2 years in which the face of clowns were changed forever with these two movies. I adore the scary designs of these alien-looking clowns, because of course they are aliens, and they're just so disturbing. I need to get the fourth one, but the fourth one is a special edition that's like crazy expensive. It's like $100 or something, and I'm like, I can't justify that. But I love Killer Clowns, and you'd think as much as I'm talking about it, it would be my favorite from this year. But it is not. No. That actual honor goes to 1998's best horror movie, in my opinion, Child's Play. That's right. It introduced Chucky to the world. Chucky and Freddy are my two favorite horror icons. So Child's Play and Child's Play 2, I think, are the best in the entire series. Child's Play 3, not far behind, in my opinion. But Child's Play started it all. It's Don Mancini's written vision. It is Tom Holland's directing. It's scary. It's great effects. It's the introduction for me to the voice of Chucky, Brad Dourif, of course, in both human and vocal form. It launched a whole series that now has 7 movies, the remake also, and then a TV series coming from the Sci-Fi Channel later this year. So you can't not mention Child's Play in 1988 as the best horror movie, in my opinion. So 1989 had some interesting choices. You had Shocker, you had the original Pet Sematary, you had the very first Julian Sands Warlock, but the movies that I like, again, they're not always ones that everyone is going to like, and in this case, my runner-up, probably not one that is everyone's favorite, but it's part of my favorite franchise, so A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child. For whatever reason, this one has always stuck out to me. I enjoy it almost as much as Part 4, which I enjoy, almost as much as Part 3, so I really like this core trilogy of Nightmare movies, 3, 4, and 5. And 5, The Dream Child, had some interesting stuff. The child, Jacob, not necessarily the best actor, but it was a fun concept where when the child would sleep, Freddy could come out, and even if people around them weren't sleeping, he could still affect the world. So I appreciated that. It's almost a forerunner to what happened in New Nightmare and the meta-ness of that. So it was the continuation of Alice's story. I always thought Alice was badass. I liked her husband Dan. It was unfortunate to see what happened to him. However, one of the coolest effects in the franchise was that motorcycle death. So one of my favorite kills, the comic book kill. The comic book nerd that goes up against Super Freddy. Faster than a bastard maniac. You guys have seen the Super Freddy and a couple of the other pics on the shelves. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, believe it or not. But my favorite movie of the year, and I guess it might also fight with Nightmare on Elm Street 5, because I'll probably watch Nightmare on Elm Street 5 more than I watch this, but I really like this movie. It's a classic water creature movie that not enough people talk about, and that's Leviathan. I really appreciated Leviathan. It was this really cool creature design. So this deep sea diving team encounters this creature under the surface, and it kind of follows them up to their station, and they're trying to, escape it, but it's picking them off. And then you get a couple of full reveals of the creature throughout the movie. There's a big confrontation at the surface at the end where you get a good look at it, where it's like part anglerfish, part something that looks like the trench from the Aquaman movie, like a lot of really cool stuff. But they didn't shy away from showing the creature, which I felt didn't happen enough growing up. So in 1989, when I got to see this, I was like, oh, this is really cool. This is one of the gems that when I rented it from, must have been Video Update at the time, I was enamored with it because we had such cool creature stuff to see. It's, it's very static by today's standards, but it's all practical, which is nice. So I quite enjoy Leviathan. That's going to be my favorite, kind of tied with Nightmare 5 of 1989. So that's it for my favorite horror movies of every year of the 80s, you guys. So as I was finishing up this video, all 40 years, it ended up being just over 2 hours. So I've decided to go ahead and split up the videos. Obviously, if you see the title of this, you know it's part 1. Wasn't always intended to be, but as you can also see, each part is going to end up being about 30 minutes. So it's still going to be substantial. And you're going to get 4 parts, and each part is going to focus on a different decade. So this episode was the 80s, next one will be the 90s, then it'll be the aughts, then it'll be the 10s. It breaks up quite nicely, actually, so that's what we're going to do. But that's it for today's episode of Cecil's favorite horror movie from every year he's been alive. Thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I've been Cecil Laird himself. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting the channel. We greatly appreciate every single one of you guys. And if you enjoyed the video, click the like button. I'm not sure how far apart I'm going to spread these videos. You probably won't see them weekly. You might see them every couple weeks or maybe monthly, but there's going to be 4 episodes. So thanks again. I've been Cecil Laird, and remember, guys, stay scared.